Hello, welcome to Cosmic Disclosure. I'm your host, David Wilcok, and we're here with Goode. And in this episode, we're going to get into a very interesting subject, something we have not covered before, the inner Earth. And this is a really unusual area. So, Corey, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's just get this out of the way first so nobody starts hurling brickbats at us. You are not saying that the Earth is hollow on the inside and that there's a sun in the middle. Nothing like that.
Correct. It instead of a hollow Earth, we would call it more of a honeycomb Earth. A large network of porous caverns that range larger than the size of Texas. Huge caverns that run all the way, to about 40 miles below the surface, the crust, where it goes down to the mantle.
Now, when I spoke with the Space Program Insider, who I can call Jacob about this, who worked directly with the Rothschilds, he said that it is a basic part of physics as a planet forms. And in the rotation, as it starts to cool, he said that the outside cools first. And then the forces of centrifugal force kind of throw the material against the edge, and you get these bubbles that form because the edge is solid, and then some of the material is bouncing off of that, and it creates this sort of cavern. And he was saying that you could have caverns that are anywhere between 20 to 40 miles deep inside the actual cavern. So did you hear anything like that about the actual geophysics of how these cavities are formed?
Yes, pretty close, and the caverns are much bigger than that.
Really?
Yeah.
So what did you hear about how they were formed?
That pretty much it had to do with the centrifugal motion, certain elements and certain types of rocks as they formed. Certain types of stone were heavier and lighter than each other, and so they started to move towards the outside. And then there is a somewhat viscous or molten layer between the crust and the main mantle, and that the mantle itself is full of water. And there's tons more water on Earth than we know of.
Well, and we've been talking about this, you and I have been talking about this since last October. I've been talking about it with other insiders for a long time, and I was stunned to see mainstream scientific papers saying that they now think there's twice as much ocean water below the crust than all the oceans that we see above the crust. Twice as much. So this is a very unusual subject to try to get people talking about. Some of that ocean water, that twice as much ocean water, is forming oceans inside these cavities in the Earth?
Yes, there's some of it is small amounts of water that is built up into porous rock, and some of it is open areas of large closed-in oceans, and some areas are like rivers where the water flows through the mantle.
Nobody would argue, especially with Earth, that where you're going to have water, you're also going to have the presence of life, at the very least microbial life. So I guess one of the really bizarre sort of learning curves to bring people through on this subject is we're not just talking about a big empty rock chasm inside the Earth. What do we actually see? If you were to be able to get into one of these, what do you actually see?
Up until recently, the only information I had was what was presented to me on one of the smart glass pads. And there were many expeditions down to this porous earth or honeycomb earth area. And these people were looking for ancient artifacts. That's what they were mainly looking for. They could care less about a lot of the other stuff they were finding. But they documented it as a part of the expedition. They were finding all types of microbial life. Some of it were kind of like lichen that grow on rocks that absorb and eat stone, but release light and provided, and this stuff grew thick, almost like mats of algae, like a bacterial algae that would grow on the stone. And it provided
is it enough that you can actually see?
It provided a low luminescent, a certain spectrum of the full spectrum that we're used to seeing.
Wow.
There were certain types of plant life that were able to, I guess, photosynthesize this light. Were they unusual plants from our perspective? Yes, they were different types. This is a totally different type of ecosystem that developed completely independent of the surface. You know, like, and some of them, similar ones have been found close to the surface. I saw, giant newts that are completely albino. You know, weird, just a bunch of strange animal life.
Like mammal life with fur? That kind of stuff?
Some spiders, some different types of insects.
So did you see spiders that would be kind of gigantic compared to what we see on the surface? Anything strange like that with the insects?
Right. A lot of them didn't have the pigment that they did on the surface. Some of them were some of the things that are large on the surface are smaller below. Some of the things that you would expect to be smaller were larger. There was kind of a, I don't know how to describe it, it was kind of backwards a little bit.
So there was a lot of whitish creatures?
White or just light pigment, not a bright, not a wide spectrum of colors like you would see on the surface, since we have a broad spectrum of light to reflect off of them.
What about like lobsters, shrimp, crabs, crustaceans?
There were several different types of crustacean things down there.
Shellfish?
Yeah, more like shellfish.
And I'm sure you had lots of regular fish, like fish you'd see in the rest of the ocean, or similar?
Lots of different fish that didn't have eyes. There's a bunch of different type of fish that were documented that were rather small.
Any bats or flying creatures? Birds?
I don't recall seeing anything flying in there. And the plant life was small. It was obviously not only living off of the rock, but all in the minerals in the rock, but also the very dim light that was being put off by this weird lichen or bacteria that was growing in a thick mat all along the inside of the cavern that was eating the rock. And as a byproduct of eating the rock, it was somehow converting some of the minerals or energy into light. It was giving off luminescence.
So we're not going to see a forest with like evergreen trees inside the Earth. This is a totally different biosphere.
Now, this is what was shown to me. I don't know. There could be other ecosystems in different areas that have more of this.
Right.
So I'm not going to say
terraforming.
Yeah, I'm not going to say that doesn't exist. But in the expedition files and information that I saw when they were looking for ancient builder race technology, back when they were trading it off-world for things, they were finding a lot of this type of stuff that I'm describing, and this is what was being documented in their expedition files.
When we see these plants that you said were down there, are they green? Are they kind of an orange or a pale color? What are we looking at as far as the plants?
They were they were not green. They were photosynthesizing through, they were different colors. Some of them were luminescent as well. Some of the plants.
What do you mean by luminescent? Like they glowed?
They glowed. They gave off light.
Really?
There were a lot of real small, looked like fern-like plants that I saw in photographs, but they were typically small, and they were either small singular plants or they looked like they were part of a larger colony, a plant that was of a colony of some sort, like a root system colony plant.
Did you have mushrooms down there?
Yeah, there was all different types of fungus. And
did they do any work to try to see if these plants appeared in fossil form in previous civilizations on the surface of the Earth?
That was not in the report. That was not their interest. They were basically documenting their expedition towards their goal of locating certain ruins and technology that was below the surface.
If a human being of our size is walking through, and you say these plants are small, so we're not dealing with trees that would be taller than we are?
No, they weren't walking through with machetes, hacking their way through. They were...
So most of this is what, like waist high or smaller?
Yeah, below the knee.
Below the knee?
Yeah, most of it.
And then otherwise it's just a big open space with this glowing stuff on the rock.
Right. The plant life was spread out everywhere.
So it would fill out the whole area.
Right. And I'm not a botanist. I don't know what exactly is classified as a plant or what things are classified as. So I don't know what these would be classified as, but they looked in the photographs like plants, and they were described as a type of plant life. So,
was there anything living down there that was dangerous to us? Predatory creatures that would attack us and potentially kill us or try to eat us?
Yes, they had to be very careful. There was a small lizard type of creature that was... It was not technologically advanced, but they were very intelligent. And
you're saying a human, not a lizard that walks on four legs, but a human-looking creature.
They walked on 2 legs and 4 legs. They were very dangerous. They hunted in small packs, and they showed signs of being intelligent, as in not even, they were compared to like cavemen intelligence, you know, lower intelligence kind of beings that existed down there. And they
had a human-like reptilian face?
Well, they were like a type of lizard of some type. And in the documentation...
You said they could walk on 2 legs.
Yeah, they could walk on 2 legs and 4 legs, depending on, you know, where they were going through all the caverns.
I guess I'm not really understanding then, is it something like a gray, but like a reptilian gray, or is it much more like a lizard than a gray in terms of the way it looks?
It's much more like a lizard. It's not like any type of space being. And
so the face might not look human-like at all. It's a reptile.
It's an animal.
Okay.
Yeah. And supposedly there was documentation of, I believe, a long time ago, the Mormons were digging deep caverns to, they were doing some sort of program where they were digging deep caverns, and they ran into some of these.
What's the color on them?
They're like a leathery kind of color.
Like a brown?
Like a grayish brown, but brown's not really the right color. But then again, this is taken under a different light. So if they were taken out and shown under a full spectrum light, they're probably going to appear different. You know, like they have stripes on them in different areas. I think I remember them being described as.
But they're more intelligent than any lizards on the surface of the Earth, because you said they're like cavemen.
Yes, they like use rudimentary kind of tools.
Really?
And that kind of thing. So they're very highly intelligent, but they were like animals.
So that's one of the types of being that you said was down there. Prior to what we're going to get into in later episodes with your invited trip, you had mentioned other species that you saw that were down there. So
I didn't actually see them.
You saw evidence of them on the smart glass pad.
Right.
You mentioned to me in private conversation that one of these was bald and had kind of large eyes.
And a large kind of head and pretty humanoid looking. They had real sparse kind of hair. They kind of stuck up. Not a whole lot of hair, and they were like pretty much albino-ish, had a little bit larger eyes, I guess, that had developed for the low light. These were groups going down with weapons and scientists going down on expeditions to recover information. They would run across certain groups, and out of an abundance of caution, they would engage them, and then photograph and document their remains and then move on in their expedition. So they weren't doing a big exchange program with these groups and studying them, and they seemed to know that some of them were dangerous. They were of a lower caste system than our civilization, and they obviously didn't respect their lives very much, and they were on a mission.
Going back to the caveman reptile types, were these beings fairly common in various pockets inside the Earth?
In different regions, at a certain region and at a certain depth. I seem to remember they were fairly common, and for the most part, they kept their distance, but they would attack targets of opportunity, humans, and there were incidents. So they were on site. They would engage them and kill them.
Were there any names or classifications for these different beings?
I'm not a scientist. They would give what they're most likely related to in a Latin term of what they're most closely related to, and then they had information about it, but that's just information I can't recall.
Okay. So far, we had the primitive caveman reptilian type. Right. We had the bald-headed type. And you mentioned the raptors, so let's cover those again briefly.
Yes. The raptors were this group that supposedly are remnants of the dinosaurs that have been here since before humans. It was kind of described as a proto-warm-blooded, like they're mostly warm-blooded. They're closer to birds than they are reptilians, but they kind of look kind of like both. They look kind of dinosaurish, but they have these weird scaly feathers, especially all of them have like some sort of sparsely scaled feathers down, like a plume down their neck, but the
feathers have scales?
They're not like soft, plumy feathers that you would think of. It looks like maybe a prehistoric feather. And these are higher intellectual beings. They have plumes of different colors that I was told are more pronounced. Their plumes are, and they move around. They're real jerky, kind of like birds. They kind of jerk around when they move, and they are very quick, very dangerous, and are carnivorous.
So how ugly are we talking if we see the face, like for us?
You would be terrified. Yeah.
Do they have vertical slit pupils, reptilian-looking eyes?
They were more of the bird eye.
Okay.
More like bird eyes, like the round, perfectly round.
But scales on the skin?
It doesn't look like reptilian skin, but people see them and they assume that they're reptiles, and they look like there's some sort of divergence or mixture together of bird and reptile.
Now, a bird doesn't really get facial expressions for the most part. I mean, some parakeets or whatever, they can kind of do the thing with their eyes, but do these beings have facial expressions? Or their faces are just kind of locked?
Yeah.
Do they have a beak-like proboscis or something? Do they have a mouth that kind of protrudes like a beak? Or
well, they've got the needle-sharp teeth, like similar to the reptilians, and but I mean, there's not an actual beak. The raptors, like if you Google and look at raptors, they look very much like that.
So it has an extended snout like a dinosaur?
Yeah, it's kind of dinosaurish.
Wow.
Kind of like a mixture between a reptile and kind of birdish.
So it is almost like a dinosaur head stuck on a human form.
Oh, no, not a human form. Its arms are not real long, and its legs...
Like
it's
T-Rex?
not quite like that, but the legs are longer than the arms. They're real fast. I really don't know that much about them other than the brief descriptions that were...
Do their legs look more muscular than ours? Do they have a lot of meat on them?
Yes, and they stay kind of hunched over.
So does their body almost look like a kangaroo?
Kind of like a dinosaur.
If you get into the so-called ancient astronaut research, you hear about various cultures describing gods that said they were plumed serpents.
Feathered serpents.
Feathered serpent, yeah. Do you think any of these beings ever came to the surface and maybe wanted to be worshipped or wanted to try to take on leadership roles for periods of time?
It could be these, or it could be different ancient groups calling actual reptilians feathered serpents just because they flew, and feathers are associated with flight. I don't know. I don't have any direct knowledge. I really don't have a whole lot of information on that group other than what I read. I have not interacted with them, and I don't wish to.
Sure. Do all of the caverns underground, or the majority of them, have crystal-looking pyramids and obelisks and weird buildings built by the ancient builder race? Is that something you see almost everywhere, or is it only in certain ones?
The deeper you go, the more you're going to find that kind of stuff.
Oh.
There are a lot of ruins, like strange Pueblo kind of building ruins up against like some walls of caverns, to where it looked like at one time maybe tens of thousands of people of some sort had lived down there in ruins. They found pottery. They found all kinds of signs of more primitive life, of people that had maybe taken refuge down below.
Right.
The stuff you're talking about is the stuff they were looking for, and they had to venture pretty deep to get it. A lot of it had been picked over and taken by different groups, traded off, but there is still very little of this honeycomb earth that has been explored. And post-disclosure, when everybody, you know, there's going to be a whole bunch of new type of careers for people, and there's going to be, you know, spelunkers that are archaeological spelunkers that are going to have so much here on Earth to explore and study. And there's a lot of stuff from the ancient builder race down there and other groups that have, there's been different ET refugee races, there's been ancient breakaway civilizations that have lived in different areas and moved on, and there's a lot under the ground that we've purposely been kept unaware of.
It seemed like when I talked to you about this before you got invited into the Inner Earth, which is coming up in later episodes, that we had kind of sussed out 6 types of beings that you'd been aware of at that time that were under there. So we had the primitive reptilians, we had the raptors, we had the bald-headed folks. Do you remember any of the other 3? Was there another reptilian type that you were aware of, like a reptoid?
There's a reptoid that was an ET group that they encountered below ground.
And what are they like?
The ones that were described were black, tall, very tall, not as huge and muscular, skinnier, with their heads. They didn't have the big jaws and teeth. They were more narrow-jawed. And there was a group.
When you say very tall, you like saying 9 feet or 11 feet or 14 feet? What's the range?
Not quite. I mean, very tall, as in like 8 feet.
Okay.
You know, and there's a group that. Well, I guess we were watching Jupiter Ascending together. That I was like, whoa, because it showed this elephant-looking guy. He was
piloting a ship.
Yeah.
And I sat next to you in the theater. The movie had just come out.
Yeah.
And your whole body, you went like this. Like, dude, what's going on?
Yeah.
And then you told me that you were familiar with something similar to that. Not exactly the same, but similar to that.
Yeah. And we did a little bit of digging, and there's some guy that has a whole story about a group that he encountered, that either he named or they call themselves the Darrow, that he depicted fairly accurately, that look like they have the elephant ears and the kind of the nose that's kind of droops down. And
it's almost like a trunk on an elephant.
Almost like a trunk.
A miniature trunk.
Yeah, but it's really more like one of those. It looks really more like one of those things on what are those things that are kind of like sea lions? You know, they have those things that hang in there. It's more like that. But I was shocked to see that on there on the internet, and I don't.
Well, and this all traces back to material that came out in the early 1940s called the Shaver Mysteries, of a guy who claimed to have been taken inside the Earth. And there was a negative group called the Darrow, which is what this guy that we found the videos on was describing. And there was a positive group calling themselves the TIERRA, T-E-R-O, saying they were opposing them. It independently said that there was very ancient technology inside the Earth that looked like it was made out of stone that they were looking for. Completely validated what you said, even though you'd never heard about this. And these Tarot people seemed to be very spiritual, and they were trying to stop the Darrow from coming after us. So this guy who did these videos was describing these people with these grotesque faces. It looked like they had gills on the side of the nose, like a bluish gill or something. Is that consistent with what you saw?
A slit. Yeah, a blue slit.
Now, what it said in the Shaver Mysteries, what this guy who claims to have been brought inside the Earth said, was that these beings that have these grotesque features originally looked a lot more like us. but that they were negative, and they had come to the Earth, they'd colonized the Earth, they tried to stay here, and there were some kind of energetics that changed their biology, and they realized they were mutating. Many of them left, but then some of them decided to stay, but in the process of them staying, these energies mutated them into these monstrosities. Did you hear anything like that?
All I knew is that they, what was described is that they were very nasty, or technological, could put up a good fight back, were very tactically clever, and they were avoided. They were not a good group to. You didn't want to end up in the middle of their territory at the wrong time, wherever their territory was.
Do you think that these are the groups that are responsible for what David Paulides has been saying is happening in the national parks, where people are being abducted?
There are a number of groups that are a part of that, including human groups that are taking people. But they very well could be.
Do you think that some of the national parks were deliberately built where they were because these were danger spots where some of these inner Earth civilizations that were negative lived?
Well, let's just say they were made natural reserves because of what they knew was below.
Right. Now, there's a variety of reports about reptilian areas under the surface of the Earth in America, including apparently underneath Los Angeles. There was a big one. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, there were a lot of reports about close to the surface, very close to the surface, different reptilian layers or places where small groups lived, where they would venture out to the surface from time to time, usually in arid areas. But and there were reports that were investigated by groups on Earth where people would see reptilians in the desert, and they would go and close off areas where they were coming out.
David Paulides' research also described that people were more apt to be abducted if they had bright colors or if there was a dog with them. The dog maybe is creating a lot of movement, and the color maybe can be seen on things that they have underground that are monitoring the area for human activity. Would you recommend that people go to these national parks, or would you say that people should avoid them at all costs?
I don't know. There's a lot of beauty to be had in these places, and I wouldn't want people to succumb to fear and miss out on a lot of beauty, especially sharing beautiful time with their families. But you got to be careful wherever you go. I haven't taken my family to a lot of these places just because I have known a little bit of information about what has happened around them.
Fair enough. All right. Well, we've now set the groundwork for the inner Earth, and coming up in the next episode, we're going to get into what you learned since all that, which is a very fascinating. In fact, you said this has changed your life more than any of the other experiences you've had so far.
It's been on my mind constantly since it's happened, yes.
So we'll see you next time here on Cosmic Disclosure. Thanks for watching.
Larger than the size of Texas. Huge, huge caverns that run all the way, to about 40 miles below the surface, the crust, where it goes down to the mantle.
Now, when I spoke with the Space Program Insider, who I can call Jacob, about this, who worked directly with the Rothschilds, he said that it is a basic part of physics. As a planet forms, and in the rotation, as it starts to cool, he said that the outside cools first, and then the forces of centrifugal force kind of throw the material against the edge, and you get these bubbles that form because the edge is solid, and then some of the material is bouncing off of that. So this is a very unusual subject to try to get people talking about. Some of that ocean water, that twice as much ocean water, is forming oceans inside these cavities in the earth?
Yes, there's some of it is small amounts of water that is built up into porous rock, and some of it is open areas of large closed-in oceans, and some areas are like rivers where the water flows through the mantle.
Nobody would argue, especially with Earth, that where you're going to have, and it creates this sort of cavern. And he was saying that you could have caverns that are anywhere between 20 to 40 miles deep inside the actual cavern. So did you hear anything like that about the actual geophysics of how these cavities are formed?
Yes, pretty close, and the caverns are much bigger than that.
Really?
Yeah.
So what did you hear about how they were formed?
That pretty much it had to do with the centrifugal motion, certain elements and certain types of rocks as they formed. Certain types of stone were heavier and lighter than each other, and so they started to move.
Hello, welcome to Cosmic Disclosure. I'm your host, David Wilcok, and we're here with Corey Goode, and in this episode, we're going to get into a very interesting subject, something we have not covered before, the inner Earth. And this is a really unusual area. So, Corey, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's just get this out of the way first so nobody starts hurling brickbats at us. You are not saying that the Earth is hollow on the inside and that there's a sun in the middle. Nothing like that.
Correct. It instead of a hollow Earth, we would call it more of a honeycomb Earth. A large network of porous caverns that range towards the outside, and then there is a somewhat viscous or molten layer between the crust and the main mantle, and that the mantle itself is full of water. And there's tons more water on Earth than we know of.
Well, and we've been talking about this, you and I have been talking about this since last October. I've been talking about it with other insiders for a long time, and I was stunned to see mainstream scientific papers saying that they now think there's twice as much ocean water below the crust than all the oceans that we see above the crust. Twice as much.